March 31st, 1967. London's Astoria Theatre in Finsbury Park. It was supposed to be a quiet evening of crooner music and gentle folk songs, the kind of show where middle-aged couples came to hear familiar melodies and soft harmonies. The headliner was Engelbert Humperdinck, the smooth-voiced sensation whose "Release Me" was climbing the charts. Supporting acts included Cat Stevens and the Walker Brothers. Nobody expected the opening act to set the stage on fire, literally. Harold Peterson, the venue manager, barely paid attention when told about the American opening act. Some unknown guitarist with an unpronounceable name. Opening acts were supposed to play quietly and leave. "Just don't let him play too loud," Peterson told the sound engineer. Backstage, Engelbert Humperdinck was having his hair styled when his manager brought the running order. "The American goes first, 20 minutes, then you close." "What's he play?" Engelbert asked, barely looking up. "Guitar. Blues or something." 3 doors down, in a cramped dressing room that smelled of old cigarettes and spilled beer, Jimi Hendrix sat quietly tuning his white Fender Stratocaster. His bandmates, Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell, were discussing the evening's set list, but Jimi seemed lost in his own world. His fingers moved across the strings with surgical precision, each note crystal clear in the small space. "You nervous?" Redding asked. Jimi looked up briefly, shook his head, and went back to tuning. He'd been thinking about a new song, something he'd written about fire, about passion, about heat. They'd never performed it live before. Tonight seemed like the right time to try it. The Astoria Theatre filled with the expected crowd, well-dressed couples, Cat Stevens fans, Walker Brothers followers. Margaret Wilson, 34, had come to hear Engelbert with her husband. "I wonder what this opening act is like," she said. "Probably some folk singer," he replied. "They put the quiet ones first." At 8 p.m. sharp, the house lights dimmed. Harold Peterson watched from the wings as the small figure of Jimi Hendrix walked onto the stage, followed by his rhythm section. The applause was polite, scattered, the kind reserved for unknowns. Jimi plugged in his guitar, adjusted his amplifier, and looked out at the audience. They looked back with mild curiosity. Some were still settling into their seats. A few were reading their programs. Most were waiting for this to be over, so the real show could begin. "Good evening," Jimi said quietly into the microphone. His voice was soft, almost shy. "We're going to play some music for you." He struck the opening chord of "Hey Joe," and immediately the sound was different from anything the Astoria Theatre had ever heard. Louder, rawer, more electric. Some audience members looked up with surprise. Others frowned. This wasn't what they'd come for, but Jimi's guitar spoke in languages they'd never heard before. His fingers found notes that seemed impossible, bending strings until they cried, using feedback not as a mistake but as an instrument. By the time "Hey Joe" ended, the chatter in the audience had stopped completely. "That was different," Margaret Wilson whispered to her husband. The second song was "Purple Haze," brand new, most of the audience hearing it for the first time. Jimi's voice was stronger now, more confident, and his guitar work was becoming hypnotic. Even the skeptics were paying attention. Harold Peterson stood in the wings checking his watch. 2 songs down, 1 to go, then "This American" would be gone, and the evening could return to normal. But Jimi wasn't thinking about normal. "This next song," he said into the microphone, "is called Fire." The opening riff was simple, driving, built around a rhythm that made people want to move. But there was something different about this song, something primal that reached into the chest and grabbed hold. Noel Redding's bass locked in perfectly with Mitch Mitchell's drums, creating a foundation that was both solid and urgent, like a heartbeat under pressure. Jimi began singing, his voice taking on a new edge, rawer than it had been on the previous songs. "All right now, baby, listen to what I'm trying to tell you." The lyrics were suggestive, dangerous in a way that made some of the older audience members shift uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the innocent romance of Engelbert's ballads. This was something earthier, more honest about desire and need. Harold Peterson felt sweat forming on his forehead. The volume seemed to be increasing with each verse, and he could see some patrons covering their ears. But they weren't leaving. Even the ones who looked uncomfortable were staying, drawn by something they couldn't name. The song built intensity with each verse. Jimi's guitar work became more aggressive, more passionate. His fingers moved across the fretboard like a man possessed, finding notes that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than technique. He started moving differently on stage, his whole body responding to the rhythm, hips swaying in a way that was almost scandalous for 1967 London. Margaret Wilson found herself leaning forward, mesmerized by the guitarist's movement. There was something hypnotic about the way he played, as if the music was flowing through him rather than from him. She glanced at her husband and saw that he too was completely absorbed, his usual reserved demeanor forgotten. In the wings, Cat Stevens stood transfixed. As a songwriter himself, he recognized something extraordinary happening on stage. This wasn't just performance. This was transformation. The young American wasn't playing the song. He was becoming it. The audience was no longer polite. They were transfixed. Conversations had stopped completely. Even the bartenders had ceased serving drinks, standing behind the bar with towels forgotten in their hands, watching this unknown guitarist turn a simple rock song into something approaching religious experience. Then in the middle of the song, Jimi stopped playing. He looked down at his guitar, then at the audience, then back at his guitar. Without explanation, he unplugged the instrument and laid it gently on the stage floor, right in front of his amplifiers. The rhythm section kept playing, but the audience was confused. What was happening? Was something wrong? Had the guitar broken? Jimi walked to the front of the stage, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a small box of matches. Margaret Wilson sat forward in her seat. What's he doing? Her husband had no answer. Harold Peterson felt his stomach drop. From the wings, he could see exactly what was about to happen, and every instinct told him to run onto the stage and stop it. But something kept him frozen in place. The authority in Jimi's movements. The certainty. This wasn't an accident or a mistake. This was intentional. Jimi struck a match. The small flame seemed impossibly bright against the darkened theater, cutting through the stage lights like a knife. For a moment, time stopped completely. The rhythm section continued playing, but every eye in the venue was fixed on that tiny flame, dancing between Jimi's fingers. Harold Peterson's mind raced through every possible disaster scenario. Fire codes, insurance claims, newspaper headlines about venues burning down during rock concerts. His hand moved instinctively toward the emergency phone, but something in Jimi's posture stopped him. There was no panic in the guitarist's movements, no sense of accident or mistake. This was deliberate. Margaret Wilson's heart was pounding so hard, she was sure her husband could hear it. She had never seen anything like this in her 34 years. The flame in Jimi's hand seemed to represent something larger, something dangerous and beautiful that she couldn't name but desperately wanted to understand. Engelbert Humperdinck, still watching from the wings with his hair in rollers, felt something cold settle in his stomach. In his decade of performing, he had built his career on safety, on giving audiences exactly what they expected. This unknown American was doing the exact opposite, and the audience was responding in ways Engelbert had never achieved. Jimi knelt beside his guitar with the reverence of a man approaching an altar. The white Stratocaster lay there gleaming under the stage lights, innocent and perfect, about to become something else entirely. He touched the match to the strings. The transformation was instant and violent. Flames erupted from the guitar like a living thing awakening, shooting nearly 4 feet into the air with a whoosh that could be heard even over the continuing music. The fire seemed to have its own rhythm, dancing and twisting with the beat, turning the instrument into a torch that bathed the entire stage in flickering orange and yellow light. The heat reached the front rows immediately. Margaret Wilson felt it on her face like summer sun, warm and shocking and utterly unexpected. Several people in the first few rows stood up, not from fear but from an instinct to get closer to something extraordinary. The smell hit next, burning wood and metal and something else, something chemical that made the air itself seem different. It wasn't unpleasant. It was primal, like standing too close to a campfire or a forge. The audience gasped collectively. Some people stood up. A few started to leave, thinking there was an emergency. But most remained frozen, unable to look away from what they were witnessing. Jimi stayed calm. He rose to his feet, picked up another guitar that had been waiting nearby, plugged it in, and continued the song as if setting his instrument on fire was the most natural thing in the world. The burning guitar continued to flame on the stage floor, its strings snapping one by one with sharp metallic sounds that cut through the music. The smell of burning wood and metal filled the theater. Harold Peterson's mouth was open, but no words came out. In 30 years of venue management, he had never seen anything like this. His first instinct was to call the fire department. His second was to stop the show. His third was to ban this guitarist from ever setting foot in his theater again. But he did none of these things, because something else was happening in the Astoria Theatre that night. Something he couldn't name but could feel. The audience wasn't panicking. They were mesmerized. Margaret Wilson was standing now, not from fear but from excitement. "My God," she whispered, "what is this?" Backstage, Engelbert Humperdinck heard the commotion and rushed to the wings, hair still in rollers. He saw the flames shooting up from the stage. "What the hell is that boy doing?" he demanded. Cat Stevens appeared beside them. "Is that fire?" "Real fire," Engelbert's manager confirmed. On stage, Jimi finished Fire with the same intensity he'd started it, his replacement guitar screaming through the final notes while his original instrument continued to burn at his feet. When the last note died away, he stepped back and looked at the audience. The silence was complete. Not a cough, not a whisper, not the rustle of a program. 700 people sat in absolute stillness, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Then slowly someone began to clap. The applause built gradually, then suddenly erupted into something beyond normal concert appreciation. People were cheering, shouting, some crying. Margaret Wilson found tears on her face and didn't know why. Her husband was applauding so hard his hands hurt. Jimi unplugged his guitar, nodded to his bandmates, and walked off stage with the casual confidence of someone who had just tuned a guitar rather than revolutionized popular music. He left the burned remains of his Stratocaster still smoldering on the theater floor, small wisps of smoke curling up toward the ceiling like incense. Harold Peterson stood in the wings as Jimi passed by, his hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline. The venue manager had seen thousands of performances over the years. Opera singers, jazz musicians, comedy acts, crooners, but nothing had prepared him for this moment of controlled chaos. "Son," he said quietly, his voice barely steady, "what was that?" Jimi paused and looked back at the stage, where venue staff were now carefully approaching the burnt guitar with fire extinguishers at the ready, moving like bomb disposal experts around something that might explode again. The scorch marks on the wooden stage floor were already visible, dark streaks that would never completely fade. "That was rock and roll," he said simply, his voice calm and matter-of-fact, as if he had just explained the most obvious thing in the world. Peterson watched the young guitarist disappear toward the dressing rooms, still trying to process what had just happened. In 30 years of venue management, he thought he understood entertainment. He understood crowd control, sound levels, safety regulations, and audience expectations. But this had been something else entirely, something that made all his experience seem suddenly inadequate. Engelbert Humperdinck watched the cleanup from the wings, his perfectly styled hair forgotten under the rollers, his mind reeling with implications. His manager tapped him on the shoulder with increasing urgency. "Engelbert, you're on in 15 minutes. We need to get you ready." Engelbert stared at the scorch marks on the stage floor, at the venue staff carefully sweeping up the remains of burnt strings and charred wood. The smell of smoke still hung in the air, and he could hear the audience murmuring with an energy he had never encountered before. Not excitement for what was coming, but amazement at what they had just witnessed. Engelbert stared at the scorch marks on the stage floor. "How am I supposed to follow that?" His manager had no answer. The rest of the evening proceeded as planned, but nothing felt the same. Cat Stevens performed his gentle folk songs to polite applause. The Walker brothers delivered their harmonious pop to appreciative crowds. Engelbert Humperdinck crooned his way through his greatest hits to the adoration of his fans. But everyone was thinking about the fire, about those 4 feet of flames, about the moment when rock music had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Margaret Wilson barely heard Engelbert's performance. She kept looking at the spot where Jimi's guitar had burned, kept thinking about the sound it made when the string snapped, kept feeling the heat she'd felt from the third row. "I don't think I understand music anymore," she told her husband as they walked home. "I don't think any of us do," he replied. 3 months later at the Monterey Pop Festival, Jimi Hendrix would set another guitar on fire and become famous for it. That moment would be filmed, photographed, and remembered as the birth of rock's most iconic stunt. But the real birth had happened in London at the Astoria Theatre on March 31st, 1967, in front of an audience that had come to hear crooner music and instead witnessed the invention of rock theater. In 2010, 43 years later, Engelbert Humperdinck was interviewed for a music documentary. When asked about that night in 1967, his voice grew quiet. "I'd been performing for years," he said. "I thought I understood what entertainment was. I thought I knew what it meant to hold an audience. Then this kid, this unknown American boy, set his guitar on fire, and I realized I didn't know anything at all." The interviewer asked if it changed him as a performer. "It changed all of us," Engelbert replied. "After that night, you couldn't just stand on stage and sing pretty songs anymore. The bar had been raised, or maybe burned would be a better word. Rock music became dangerous that night, and we all had to decide whether we were dangerous enough to keep up." Harold Peterson retired from venue management 5 years after that night, but he never forgot it. In his retirement speech, he said, "In 35 years, I've seen every kind of performer you can imagine, but only one ever made me question what entertainment could be. Only one ever made me realize that sometimes the most important moments are the ones you're completely unprepared for." The burned remains of Jimi's 1965 Fender Stratocaster were carefully preserved by the venue staff. In 2008, the guitar sold at auction for over $450,000, making it one of the most expensive pieces of rock memorabilia ever sold. But the real value of that night couldn't be measured in dollars. It was measured in the moment when a young guitarist from Seattle looked at an audience of Engelbert Humperdinck fans and decided to show them something they'd never seen before. Something that would change not just their evening, but the entire course of popular music. March 31st, 1967. The night rock and roll learned to play with fire.